23. January 1945, Reich Chancellery, Berlin. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows and fell across a long table covered in maps, fuel charts, and production ledgers. Heinz Guderian stood with a folded memorandum in his left hand and a pencil in his right. He had written his case in plain figures: the Vistula and the Oder, the state of the bridges, the monthly allotment of fuel, the number of operable tanks at the front on that morning. He could still hear the heavy steps of guards in the marble corridor and the murmur of voices behind the tall doors. When the doors opened and he stepped in, the air smelled of tobacco and floor wax. Adolf Hitler sat at the head of the table, with Albert Speer to one side and officers from the General Staff and the Armaments Ministry across from them. There were new maps of the Soviet bridgeheads on the Vistula and the Oder. Red pins clustered along the Vistula near Puławy, Sandomierz, and Baranów. Another line of red pins already reached the Oder near Kustrin. Guderian placed a sheet in front of him. He had drawn 3 columns: Panther, Tiger, assault gun. At the top he had written one question: how many reached the front in time? He remembered the last time he had seen a Tiger company on the move. The tanks were strong and the men were brave. Yet they were tied to fuel trucks, low loaders, and repair crews. Today he was here to argue that the army did not have the time, the petrol, or the bridges to keep sending the heaviest vehicles into a fight that was now defined by speed and by air power. He breathed in, looked at Hitler, and began to speak in a steady voice that carried across the table. Beyond the walls of the Chancellery, the facts of January 1945 were plain and cold. On 12 January, the Red Army had opened the Vistula-Oder offensive with more than 1 million men, several thousand tanks and self-propelled guns, and an artillery preparation that rolled forward for hours along a front of hundreds of kilometers. Entire German formations had been shattered or pushed back in a matter of days. Soviet spearheads leapt from the Vistula bridgeheads, and by the end of the month stood on the Oder, within 70 kilometers of Berlin. In that same month, the German fuel crisis had reached its worst level since the war began. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Pöhlitz, and Blechhammer had been bombed again and again. Trains moved slowly or not at all, rails were torn up, and locomotives stood on sidings waiting for coal. Against this background, the heavy tank stood as a symbol of strength and as a problem of logistics. The Tiger. I had been produced from 1942 to 1944 in numbers a little over 1,300. The Tiger II had entered service in 1944, and by spring 1945 total production would remain under 500. Each Tiger II weighed close to 70 tons. Its Maybach engine drank fuel at a rate that could empty the internal tanks in a march of a few hours across broken roads. Final drives and gearboxes were strong, but suffered when crews had to start and stop on soft ground or climb steep grades with little maintenance time. Recovery vehicles of equal weight were few. When a Tiger bogged down or broke a drive, the crew often had to blow charges and leave the hull behind. The Panther, by contrast, weighed around 45 tons and had been produced in far greater numbers. By late 1944, the total of Panthers that had left the factories was more than 6,000. It was still an exacting machine that required care, but it delivered a better balance of armor, gun, mobility, and cost. Assault guns such as the Sturmgeschütze III and the Jagdpanzer 38 were cheaper still, burned less fuel, and demanded fewer hours of skilled labor per hull. These were the numbers that crowded the margins of every report that crossed a staff desk in that winter. Guderian kept his eyes on the map as he talked. He began with the eastern crossings, then moved to the bridges. He had told a colleague earlier that week that numbers would decide the issue more surely than adjectives. He read from a slip of paper. One Tiger battalion on paper had 45 heavy tanks. In practice, after a week of marches and combat in deep winter, the battalion might be down to 20 or even fewer that could move and fight. A Panther battalion on paper had similar strength but would lose fewer vehicles to breakdowns and would reach the fight faster along bridges that could bear the load. A regiment of assault guns could move along secondary roads and still fight well against enemy armor and infantry with the right tactics. He laid a small ruler across the Vistula. The span of the ruler covered the Soviet bridgeheads that had been widened and deepened since the autumn. Then he moved the ruler to the Oder. He said plainly that the army needed vehicles that could move quickly to block crossings and to counterattack where the Soviets were still building up. He did not raise his voice. He did not blame the crews or the factories. He said that the heavy tank had become a luxury the front could not afford in the last months of a war fought under enemy air superiority and under a sky filled with reconnaissance planes that could find stalled columns within minutes. He quoted a report from a Tiger battalion on the Eastern Front that noted how many tanks were lost not to enemy guns, but to abandonment after mechanical failure or lack of fuel during retreats in the autumn mud. He also referenced field notes that described bridges that would not take more than 40 tons without risk. A heavy tank could still cross with careful engineer work, but time for careful work no longer existed when Soviet Tank Corps advanced 30 or 40 kilometers in a single day. Albert Speer spoke of foundry capacity, gear-cutting machines, and how many man-hours it took to build a heavy hull compared to a medium one. Guderian listened, then returned to the one point that mattered to him as a soldier: how many machines will stand beside our infantry in the next 10 days? He looked around the table and saw officers who had commanded in Poland, France, and Russia. Their faces showed fatigue, not defiance. In that room, in that hour, the Tiger was no longer a totem of invincibility. It was a question of bridges and fuel and time. The broader record supports the logic that filled the Chancellery that day. German industry had strained to build heavy tanks with thick armor and powerful guns, and the crews had fought bravely in them. On both fronts, Tiger units recorded high kill ratios at company and battalion level when conditions were favorable. Yet the strategic and operational context had changed. In 1943, at Kursk, Soviet defenses massed thousands of guns, deep mine belts, and strong rifle divisions. In 1944, the Red Army learned to combine massed artillery with ground attack aircraft and with tank and mechanized formations that bypassed strongpoints and cut supply routes. Allied air forces in the West shattered bridges and rail nodes and attacked road traffic whenever weather allowed. Fuel deliveries in late 1944 fell so low that entire battalions sat immobile. Panther units and assault gun brigades could at least disperse, move at night, and cross more bridges. Heavy tank battalions needed special rail loading points, strong bridges, and a supply park that followed them with fuel and spare parts. Otto Carius, a noted Tiger commander on the Eastern Front, later wrote that a Tiger could dominate a field of fire, but he also noted the constant strain on engines, transmissions, and crews when the terrain and the logistics did not support the weight. Technical officers kept stacks of reports that listed failures in final drives and suspensions when heavy vehicles were forced into long road marches at short notice. In plain terms, a Tiger that did not reach the battlefield was not a weapon but a promise. That afternoon in Berlin, when the maps showed Soviet bridgeheads growing by the hour, The promise no longer answered the need. The army needed what could be delivered to the line within days, not what could be rolled out of a factory in fewer numbers at the end of a long rail journey and a risky road march. The argument was not about bravery or about the quality of the gun. It was about mass, fuel, and time. Even the armaments chief, who had fought to keep lines open for the Tiger II, could not ignore the tide of reports that showed Panthers and assault guns arriving in larger numbers and fighting more often, because they could move on poor roads and make do with less fuel. Guderian closed his folder and pushed a summary sheet across the table. He had written 3 final points. First, shift remaining heavy production capacity to Panthers and to assault guns with proven reliability and lower fuel consumption. Second, prioritize spare parts and recovery equipment to keep existing heavy battalions alive rather than feed them new vehicles that could not be supported. Third, release heavy tank crews as cadre to train replacements for medium battalions and assault gun units that would form the backbone of the last defenses along the Oder and in Silesia. He did not say that the Tiger was a failure. He said it had become a weapon out of phase with the war that Germany was now fighting. He quoted a line he had seen in a battalion diary. "Strength is not the thickness of a plate. Strength is a column that reaches the battlefield." There was a long pause. Speer spoke again about gear-cutting capacity and bearing stock. A general at the far end of the table spoke quietly about bridge loads on the Warthe and the Neisse. Hitler asked whether the gun of the heavy tank could be mounted on a fixed hull in greater numbers. An officer from the armaments office answered that self-propelled guns could be built faster and in larger numbers on existing chassis. The talk went on into the next hour, and in that time the shape of the decision settled. Orders would follow that shifted emphasis further toward Panther and toward assault guns. Tiger Fouon production had already ended in 1944. Tiger II production would continue in small numbers where hulls and turrets were already in flow, but no one in the room believed that heavy battalions alone would retrieve the situation along the Oder. When Guderian stepped back into the corridor, he put the folded pencil behind his ear and thought of the men who would stand on the next line of defense with whatever machines could reach them. The marble floor was cold under his boots. Outside, the city was dark in the winter afternoon. Inside, one weapon had lost its primacy, not in a factory and not on a testing ground, but in a room where maps showed a tide that could only be held by units that could move, cross bridges, and fight under a sky that no longer belonged to Germany. Heinz Guderian returned to the general staff rooms at Zossen on the morning of 24th of January 1945, with the same folder under his arm and a fresh stack of frontline signals waiting on his desk. The underground corridors smelled of stale air and coal smoke from the surface vents. He set the folder down, rolled a clean map of the Oder bend around Kustrin across a table, and drew a pencil line from Frankfurt an der Oder north to Landsberg. The line was not a plan. It was a boundary of time. The first reports of Soviet armor on the east bank of the Oder had come in before dawn. A teleprinter clerk brought him a message from Army Group A that mentioned fuel loads in liters per vehicle and the number of tanks that could march in the next 24 hours. He read it twice. Then he reached for a small ledger where he had noted, in simple lists, the number of bridges on the Neisse and the Oder that could accept more than 40 tons. The number was not 0, and it was not enough. The weight of a Tiger II sat in his mind like a stone. He could hear the calm voice of a Tiger Company commander he had spoken to in the autumn, near East Prussia. The officer had said that his men could fight, that their gunnery was sound, that the 88mm gun could defeat any Soviet armor at long range, and that none of this mattered when the first low bridge on a side road forced the column to stop and search for an engineer detour, while enemy reconnaissance aircraft circled. Guderian opened the folder and slid out a paper he had written in his own hand with 3 lines in thick script: bridges, fuel, repair. He placed it at the edge of the table where any officer who came in would have to see it. He did not pace or raise his voice. He called for the Panzertruppen branch and for a liaison from the Armaments Ministry. When they arrived, he spoke in short sentences. "We will keep the heavy battalions that already stand on the front. We will feed them spares, recovery vehicles, and fuel as best we can. We will not send new heavy battalions to chase a moving front. We will keep Panthers and assault guns in the rail net and push them to the Oder crossings, where they can still arrive before the Soviets widen the bridgeheads." He asked for the latest return from the Skoda works and from the BMM plant in Prague, where the Jagdpanzer 38 had been coming off the lines in steady numbers since the previous year. He asked for the status of Panther shipments from plants around Hanover and for the available locomotives and wagons. The room filled with the quiet sound of pencils on paper and the clack of a teleprinter in the outer office. He had made his case in Berlin. Now the work was to turn a decision into moving columns of steel that could cross ordinary bridges and still fight. The broader picture that pressed on those pages at Zossen can be read in the plain figures of that winter. On 12 January 1945, the Red Army opened the Vistula-Oder offensive with rifle fronts that counted their men in millions and that placed several thousand tanks and self-propelled guns along the jump-off line from Baranov and Sandomierz to Puławy and Magnuszów. Artillery opened for hours with fire plans that used hundreds of thousands of shells along a front measured in hundreds of kilometers. German defensive lines were thin and often filled with replacement battalions that had never trained together as units. By 17 January, Soviet columns entered Warsaw. By 19 January, they were across the Wartha. By 31 January, forward elements stood on the Oder near Kustran. In the west, Allied air forces struck rail nodes and fuel plants day after day when the weather allowed. Synthetic fuel production at Leuna, Politz, and Blechhammer had been battered through 1944 and limped along in early 1945 at a fraction of earlier capacity. Rail bridges that could have carried heavy tank columns were cut and would take days to patch even with skilled engineer units. Panthers rolled on the rails in greater numbers and could be offloaded on more sidings. Assault guns like the Sturmgeschütz III and the Jagdpanzer 38 came from factories in Tull, Bohemia and southern Germany in steady flows and could be pushed by rail to lines at Frankfurt, an der Oder, Guben, and Görlitz, with less strain on scarce locomotives. These vehicles had thinner armor and smaller crews than a Tiger, yet they could turn up at the right place in time to matter. This arithmetic did not deny the battlefield strength of a heavy tank, where terrain and logistics allowed it to deploy and fight. Tiger battalions had records of high kills in set-piece defenses and in ambush. Yet the war had shifted to a race of marches and countermarches, where a column that failed to cross a small bridge at dusk risked being pounded by artillery or cut off by morning. German bridge ratings on many rural spans ran to classes far below the 60 or 70 tons that a Tiger II demanded. Engineers could reinforce a span with timbers and trestles, but that took hours that a retreating corps did not possess. Reports from the front recorded heavy tanks stuck near culverts or at the approaches to blown bridges with engines idling, while crews debated whether to risk a crossing. Some crossed and made it. Some did not. The cost in time was felt across entire corps sectors. In the same files, one finds notes that Panther columns crossed by detouring through a market square and then over a second-class span that would have collapsed under a heavier vehicle. These fragments of field reality underline a strategic truth. A weapon that cannot reach the battlefield on the day it is needed is not a weapon in that war. In that winter of scarcity, the decisive numbers were not gun calibers and armor thickness. They were bridge ratings, lighters of fuel on hand, locomotives available, and the number of hours until first light. The message came from the Führer headquarters in the evening of the 24th. A new army group Vistula would be formed. Heinrich Himmler would command it. Guderian sat with the paper in his hand and felt the dry weight of a decision that had nothing to do with the front line. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached for the telephone. He spoke with commanders along the Oder line, asked for their latest positions, and told them to keep their eyes on bridges and ferry crossings. He did not vent. He did the one thing he could do inside his authority. He pushed faster for what the front could actually use in the next 10 days. He called Speer and repeated his request for Panther shipments to be prioritized and for rail clearances to move assault gun brigades to the Oder. Speer said the plants would do it. Guderian said that plants were not a front line and that railwaymen and gendarmes would have to pull civilian trains into sidings to clear the way. That meant orders signed with urgent signatures. He hung up and rubbed his eyes. He thought of the crews inside Tigers who were already dug in along the East Prussian lines and in Silesia. He did not want any man to think that he was taking a weapon out of his hands. He told the MO, Panzertruppenbranch, to send a directive to heavy battalions that emphasized recovery and maintenance, that guaranteed priority on spare final drives and track sections, and that ordered engineer support to be attached to heavy battalion sectors where possible. He also told them to prepare a simple circular for Panther and assault gun units that reminded commanders to disperse under trees by day and to march by night whenever the sky was clear. He signed both documents. Then he opened a small notebook and copied a line from a Tiger commander he respected. The note read in simple terms: "The gun is a marvel. The tank is a burden that the road and the bridge cannot forgive." He closed the notebook and stood. The train of orders he had set in motion would move with the speed of signals and the slowness of steel. He could only push the levers he had. Outside the bunker, the snow was falling again across Brandenburg. Inside, typewriters tapped out schedules that would send Panthers south from Hanover, Jagdpanzer 38 cars east from Prague, and piles of spare parts north from Magdeburg. The men who would receive them were already at their posts, the river lines, looking out over flat ice and listening for engines they could not see. The wider record of the last days of January and the first week of February confirms the pattern that drove those orders. Panther units arriving near Kustrin and Frankfurt an der Oder were committed to short counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads. They could enter the fight by crossing ordinary spans and by using ferries where engineers had set them up. Assault gun brigades were used as mobile anti-tank reserves behind infantry divisions that had been pulled together from exhausted regiments and replacement pools. Heavy battalions that were already in place fought with valor. Their guns took a toll whenever they could deploy in prepared positions with clear fields of fire. Yet the movement of new heavy units to the critical sectors lagged behind the pace of events. Rail lines were cut or choked. Fuel trains sat on sidings under camouflage nets. When a heavy battalion did arrive, it often required days to sort out vehicle losses from rail offloading, cold weather starts, and mechanical faults brought on by repeated stops and starts during the rail journey and the final road march. In the same time frame, The Skoda and BMM plants sent dozens of Jagdpanzer 38 vehicles each week into the field, and Panther production lines still delivered enough hulls that, when matched with the remaining rail capacity, could keep the Oder line supplied with vehicles that moved and fought. In strategic terms, the decision to emphasize medium and assault vehicles had been made by force of circumstance long before any formal note recorded it. The meeting at the Chancellery had given it a name and a memory. How German generals made the Tiger tank obsolete in one afternoon does not mean that the machine lost its gun or its armor in that hour. It means that the war that remained could not pay the price of weight and fuel for a promise of power that roads and bridges would not deliver in time. In that sense, the conclusion had been in the files for months. On 24 January, it found a voice that could compel action. The consequence played out in train yards, on icy roads, and on riverbanks that winter. A Panther and a line of assault guns arriving at dusk were worth more than a heavy column crawling toward a bridge that would not hold by dawn. The men who crewed the heavy machines did not give up their pride or their skill. They fought where they stood and where they were already dug in. The staff officers who shifted the flow of steel did not deny that pride. They accepted the limits of bridges and fuel and chose mass that could move. That is the sober core of the story. Heinz Guderian slept in a narrow bunk at Zossen for 3 hours and woke on 25th of January before dawn to the hard chop of a field telephone in the corridor and the rhythm of teleprinters in the signals room. He washed his face, drank a cup of bitter coffee, and walked back into the map room with his notebook and the same pencil he had used in Berlin. The snow had stopped during the night, and the air in the bunker was dry and warm. He asked for the latest strength return from Panther units in transit and for the list of bridges over the Oder that could take loads above 40 tons without special work. A young operations officer read from a slip and put it on the table. Kustrin, Frankfurt an der Oder, Guben, Görlitz. Some spans intact, some patched. He marked each crossing with a small circle and then drew arrows that matched the rail offloading points on the western bank. He kept his language plain as men came in and out. The first push is to put Panthers and assault guns into sectors where infantry divisions are already in contact with Soviet forward units. We do not send Tigers on rail journeys through broken yards unless they are already on those rails with engines warm and crews ready. We keep heavy battalions where they stand and feed them spares, fuel, and engineer help. He read a signal from 9th Army that described a column of heavy tanks delayed at a weak culvert near a village south of Landsberg, while enemy air observers circled overhead. He placed the paper beside a second message that recorded an assault gun brigade arriving by rail near Frankfurt an der Oder in the night and taking positions behind an infantry regiment before dawn. He circled both messages and wrote one sentence that captured the contrast in a way any officer could feel. One column waited under the sky. One column reached the line before first light. He sent a short directive to the rail authorities to clear lines from Hanover and Prague for Panther and Jagdpanzer 38 traffic and to hold civilian wagons on sidings if needed. He spoke again to Albert Speer and asked for daily shipment figures in plain totals with no adjectives, the armaments. Chief promised to send them by evening. Guderian returned to his ledger and copied the figures that mattered to a staff that had to fight with clocks. Number of Panthers promised. Number that actually left a factory gate. Number that reached a divisional railhead. Number that rolled off flat cars with crews and fuel. These blunt lists were a way to keep the mind on the road and the bridge rather than on the ideal of a unit strength table that the front could no longer support. At noon, he put down his pencil and listened to a Tiger battalion commander on a scratchy line from Silesia. The voice was steady. The gun can still do its work. The crew can still hold a field of fire. But we cannot move once we leave the village street. The bridge will not take us. We dug in 2 machines and will fight from there. Guderian thanked him and promised parts and engineers. When the call ended, he looked at the map and thought of the men inside those steel hulls who would do their duty and pay for every kilometer they had to march on bad roads in cold weather. He did not curse the machine. He trimmed the plan to the road that still existed. The wider battlefield of those days can be read in the rhythm of Soviet advance and German improvisation. On 25 January, the Red Army had already covered ground that would have taken weeks in earlier campaigns. Riflemen and tank crews moved across frozen fields, and pontoon regiments threw bridges over rivers in hours. The Vistula Oder offensive had begun with massed artillery and had continued with columns that bypassed strong points and raced for crossings. By the last week of January, forward elements of the 1st Belarusian Front stood on the east bank of the Oder near Kustrin and at points south, while the 1st Ukrainian Front pressed toward the Nysa and the Oder farther south through Silesia. In the west, Allied bombers kept pressure on the rail net and on the synthetic fuel plants that had fed German engines for 2 years. The result was a landscape where fuel drums stood under snow near sidings and where locomotives waited for orders while men in the field needed steel at once. It is in this context that the shift toward Panthers and assault guns gained its real meaning. The Jagdpanzer 38 had begun to leave the BMM and Skoda works in steady flows in the previous year, and continued to do so in early 1945. These vehicles were small, low, and used less fuel. They could ride flat cars in numbers and could roll off, warm up, and move through a town and across ordinary spans without the same risk that a 70-ton machine carried. The Sturmgeschütz III, built in large numbers over the previous years, still filled the order of battle in many assault gun brigades, and its crews had long experience in fighting enemy armor from hull-down positions and in street fighting. Panther production had never matched the hopes of planners in every month, but the output was still large enough that hundreds left factories across late 1944 and early 1945. Reports from the front show that Panthers could be brought forward along lines that had been patched after air raids and then sent along roads that still had bridges fit for their weight class. None of this denied the pure battlefield power of the Tiger gun or the morale effect that heavy armor could have on the men inside and the enemy in front of them. It did, however, measure power against the only currency that counted in January and February 1945, which was the ability to reach the fight and to remain in it for more than a few hours on the fuel carried in the hull and in the trucks behind it. Field notes recorded that a Panther company could be refueled from a small fuel park and sent on a short march to support an infantry counterthrust across a village street. The same notes recorded that a heavy company required tanker trucks that could not be spared from larger movements, and that a single broken bridge could ruin a day of effort. Engineers wrote that timber and trestle work for a heavy crossing took hours and needed carpenters and sappers who were already overtasked. In plain speech, the medium machine could slip through the lines of a battered rail net and a damaged road grid and still be a weapon on arrival. The heavy machine was a fortress that needed a road and a bridge and a plan measured in hours that the front no longer had. In the last days of January and the first days of February, the work at Zossen turned into a daily cycle that matched the speed of events at the river line. Guderian received shipment totals by evening from the armaments office and placed them beside signals from divisional headquarters. He called commanders on the Oder and the Nysa and asked for their honest state. He told them to place Panthers and assault guns behind the sectors where Soviet bridgeheads showed the first signs of permanent crossing points. He urged them to pull heavy tanks back from exposed village edges to positions where the ground was firmer and where engineers could prepare hard standings so that engines did not sink in thawing fields. He repeated the same advice in plain words: disperse by day, march by night, use side streets and shelter, keep a recovery plan at hand. This advice may sound simple on a page, but voices from the front confirm how important it was at a time when every column that stayed in the open by day drew fire from artillery and aircraft. One Panther battalion reported that it moved by night across 3 small towns and reached a wood line behind an infantry regiment before dawn, at which point the commander wrote in his diary that he could hear the enemy working on their bridge and knew that he had hours to prepare his own line of fire. In contrast, a heavy unit recorded an entire day spent seeking a second-class bridge that would take a single vehicle at a time, with pioneers laying planks and men watching the sky while the column was stationary. The world beyond these unit reports, also, moved in ways that confirmed the staff logic. Army Group Vistula was formed on paper and given to Heinrich Himmler, a decision that Guderian received with a look that he kept to himself, then turned into practical orders that ignored the name at the top of the paper and went to the officers who actually moved trains and guns. Soviet spearheads widened bridgeheads near Küstrin and south of Frankfurt on der Oder, and the village fights along the western bank began to harden into strongpoints that would be known in March by names that have a hard sound: Altblaen, Reitwein, Kienitz. The men who would later fight in the ruins of Küstrin Fortress were already at work building positions and registering fields of fire. In Silesia, the First Ukrainian Front drove across the Oder and the Neisse in multiple sectors, while German units tried to form lines that linked intact bridges and villages that had stone walls and cellars. The movement of Panthers and assault guns into these sectors did not change the course of the war, but it did create moments where counterattacks closed small gaps and where infantry had steel at their side when enemy tanks appeared on a village street. Guderian read these moments into his own routine. He kept the front in his head as a map and as a street corner seen at dawn in winter. He knew that the man in a Panther turret and the man in an assault gun could not feel the weight of a decision taken in a meeting room. They felt the weight of a shell fragment on a glacis and the cold of a wind through a hatch. He owed them a plan that put them where their engines and their bridges would not fail them before first contact. The broader sweep of February brought 2 threads together in a way that underlined the afternoon in Berlin, when numbers had finally humbled pride. The first thread was the continued strain on fuel, rails, and bridges. Synthetic plants stumbled on and then stopped, and stocks fell to levels where a course commander counted not days but hours of movement for his vehicles. Allied air forces cut marshalling yards, and each cut forced detours that added hours to the journey of a flat car carrying a tank. Bridges were patched and then cut again. Road columns moved by night and hid by day. Within this harsh frame, the medium machine and the low assault gun proved what staff papers had argued. They crossed more bridges and reached more sidings, and could fight more often in the places where combat actually happened, which were streets, tree lines, and the edges of villages. Reports recorded kill claims from heavy guns that still spoke with authority when a Tiger was dug in at the edge of a field and enemy machines rolled into view. They also recorded the time lost while towing a heavy machine that had lost a final drive during a hurried move, or the sad line that a crew had fired charges and left a hull because fuel had run out and recovery was not possible. The second thread was leadership, Army Group Vistula under Tefruum. Himmler failed to produce the calm staff work that the crisis demanded. Guderian argued for a seasoned field commander to take the group and finally secured the appointment of Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrizi in March. That change lay ahead, but in February, the effect of poor coordination could be felt in delays and in orders that did not match ground truth. In that atmosphere, the clear policy that prioritized Panthers and assault guns for immediate reinforcement became a fixed point inside a swirl of uncertainty. A short counterattack near Kustrin with a handful of Panthers from a division that had just arrived could push a bridgehead back a kilometer or stabilize a road for a day. An assault gun brigade placed behind a battered infantry division could turn a Soviet probe into a costly exchange and buy time for a new line a few kilometers to the rear. These small events were the currency of a final winter. They did not reverse the tide, but they paid down the collapse by hours and days. The story of how German generals made the Tiger tank obsolete in one afternoon is not a sneer at a machine or at the men who loved it. It is a record of how a staff accepted that weight, fuel, and bridge ratings can defeat even the strongest gun when time is measured in trains that must arrive before dawn. Guderian did not walk out of the Chancellery thinking he had won an argument about history. He walked out thinking about a culvert on a side road and about a panther that could cross it tonight with a crew that would still be in position at first light. He thought about a tiger crew that would fight from a barnyard and do their work until their ammunition was gone, and how to send them spare parts and engineers rather than a promise of a new heavy company that would never reach them. He lived that calculation through February with a pencil and a ledger and with calls to men who gave him the truth without adornment. The war pressed on. The sky stayed hostile. The rails stayed broken. Yet inside those limits, the staff found a way to move steel that could still matter at the point where a village road meets a riverbank. That is how an afternoon can change a war for men on a map and for men inside tanks. It is not a legend. It is a ledger written in the language of bridges, fuel, and time, and it carried the weight of a nation's last winter. Heinz Guderian spent the last week of January moving between the map room and the signals desk with a pace that never turned into hurry. He kept a small ledger open beside him and wrote the same plain headings each day. Panthers promised, Panthers loaded, Panthers arrived, assault guns promised, assault guns arrived. He added a third list for spare parts and recovery vehicles and drew a line under it so that his eye could find it first. When a clerk brought in a front-line return from Ninth Army, he set his pencil down and listened while the young man read out the number of tanks that had crossed ordinary spans during the Chol night and the number that had been held up at damaged culverts. He asked the clerk to read the place names again so that he could mark them with light touches of the pencil. Kustrin, Genschmar, Reitwein, Frankfurt under Oder. The rhythm in the bunker was steady. A staff officer entered with a note from the armaments office about factory output in Hanover and in Prague. A chief of engineers reported on the timber and vehicles needed to stiffen a span to take 40 tons and then 60. A teleprinter clattered with a message from an infantry corps that had placed a company of assault guns behind a village road that the Soviets had tested with patrols at dawn. The detail that pulled his attention that morning was a line from a Tiger commander in Silesia. The officer wrote that he had dug in 2 vehicles on firm ground beside a stone wall and that he could see the first enemy probes across an open field at 800 meters. The commander wrote that he had no wish to surrender a weapon that he respected and that his gun team was strong. He then added a sentence that was almost an apology to the machine. If we move, we lose time and fuel and may lose a gearbox. If we stand, we can still do our work. Guderian folded the message and placed it under the edge of his ledger. He knew the tone. It was the voice of an officer who had balanced courage against terrain and logistics and had chosen a way to fight that kept his crew in the battle. The meetings of that week were not about abstractions. They were about the weight of a hull on a weak bridge in a small town where the church spire had been chipped by artillery. They were about an assault gun that could slide between houses in the night and take a position behind a hedge before the light came. He signed orders that moved rail clearances to Panther shipments and that assigned engineer companies to heavy tank sectors that were already in place. He ended each evening by copying a few figures again in a neat hand so that he could see them at a glance when he woke. He wrote them without adjectives: trains loaded, bridges rated, vehicles at the line by dawn. He closed the ledger and let his hands rest on it a moment, as if to still the clatter of the bunker. Then he stood, put the pencil behind his ear, and went to the signals room to listen to one more voice from the river before he slept. The broader front in those days was a field of movement that can be counted in simple measures. The Vistula Oder offensive placed the First Belarusian Front and the First Ukrainian Front across the breadth of Poland, with more than 1 million men, thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, and an artillery park that sent hundreds of thousands of shells forward in the opening days. The Red Army widened its bridgeheads on the Vistula, and then leapt toward the Oder with columns that used the winter ground to skirt strongpoints and cut roads. Warsaw fell on 17 January. By the end of that month, forward Soviet elements stood on the east bank of the Oder, along a line that ran through Kustrin and southward. German formations that had once prided themselves on exact movements now lived inside a rail network that had been cut by repeated airstrikes. Synthetic fuel plants that had carried the weight of the war for 2 years ran at a fraction of earlier output. Locomotives idled on sidings under snow. Fuel drums stood in sheds that were empty by afternoon. In this landscape, the choice that had been pressed in the Chancellery became a fact on the ground. Panthers left factory gates in larger numbers than heavy tanks and could be moved across patched rails to divisional sidings that still functioned. Assault guns left Bohemian factories each week in numbers that meant that a brigade could be formed and sent to a sector within a few days. They arrived with crews that had trained as infantry in earlier years and now fought as tank destroyer men with low silhouettes and a habit of finding cover behind walls and trees. The Tiger gun still spoke with a voice that no enemy crew could ignore when the hull sat on firm ground with a clear field of fire. Yet the journey to the field of fire now decided more fights than the caliber of a barrel. Engineers wrote in their reports that a span rated for 30 tons could be stiffened to take 40 with timber and trestle. A span rated for 40 could be forced to take a Panther with careful movement and reduced spacing. A span that could take a Tiger II required hours of work and the presence of men with skills who were already in short supply. A unit that had to wait for that work stood on a road that enemy reconnaissance could find by daylight. Allied fighter bombers and Soviet artillery punished waiting columns. Field notes from the front list losses that did not come from enemy tanks. They came from engines that failed in stop and start marches and from fuel trucks that did not appear on time. In this way, the heavy machine began to lose its value not in a duel, but in a ledger. The figure that counts a machine that reached the line before dawn weighed more than a figure that promised a machine at noon and delivered it at dusk to a road that had already moved. How German generals made the Tiger obsolete in one afternoon can be understood in these numbers. It was not a line in a book. It was the choice to feed what could move and to stop sending what could not move in time. Once the rail net and the bridges and the fuel were measured without pride, the result followed. The first week of February brought a fresh routine that still revolved around the same plain points. Guderian spoke with Albert Speer each evening and asked for totals without qualifiers. The armaments chief sent numbers for Panthers and assault guns that had left factory gates and for the loads that had reached railheads within the day. Guderian placed those beside signals from Corps along the Oder Bend and in Silesia and noted where arrivals matched requests. He then took calls from frontline officers. He listened to an assault gun commander near Frankfurt under Oder who described moving through a town in darkness and taking a hull-down position behind a stone wall that gave him a field of fire into a street where Soviet tanks had appeared at noon. The man spoke with quiet satisfaction about the match between his machine and the terrain that night. He listed his fuel in liters, his ammunition load in rounds, and his losses in men. He then paused and said that a heavy vehicle could not have joined him on the route he had used, because the bridge in the town square had a rating that no one would test with a machine that weighed 70 tons. The call ended with a simple request. Keep the fuel coming and send spare track sections. A few hours later, Guderian spoke with a heavy tank officer in Silesia who had fought from a defensive stand on firm ground. The officer reported several enemy vehicles destroyed at long range, and then noted that 2 of his machines had broken final drives when they were ordered to move to a new line in the afternoon on a road that was rutted and covered with refrozen mud. He asked for recovery vehicles and pioneer support to prepare standing positions that would keep engines and transmissions from working against soft ground. Guderian promised both and wrote in his ledger a small reminder in his own hand. Help heavy crews live in place. Move medium crews toward the sound. He met that afternoon with the Panzertruppen branch and asked for a weekly rotation that would send engineer platoons to the sectors where heavy battalions had dug in and would keep Panther and assault gun brigades in a posture where they could be sent by rail and road within hours to the sectors where enemy bridgeheads thickened. The staff wrote the orders in clear language and sent them across the signals net. He then returned to the larger questions that had not gone away. Army Group Vistula had been created and given to a man whose experience did not match the work. Guderian fought for a commander with the calm and the patience to stand on a line and to manage reserves by hours. In March, he would secure the appointment of Gotthard Heinrichi, a man known for careful defense and for discipline in withdrawal and in the shaping of strong points. That change was still ahead in the calendar, but the need for it already came through in delays and in orders that did not match the ground. Inside those faults, the staff at Zossen kept pushing steel that could cross ordinary spans and could fight the next morning. That is not a grand description of strategy. It is the truth of war in a month when the enemy arrived on a river that ran within a day's march of the capital. The wider record of February shows how the decision of January bore fruit in ways measured in hours and in streets. Soviet bridgeheads near Kustrin widened and stiffened. The fortress of Kustrin itself would soon be encircled and largely destroyed in fighting that would become a grim preface to the April assault on the Silo Heights. In the south, the First Ukrainian Front pushed through Silesia and made crossings that stretched the German line thin.